Hey everyone, Ryan Turford here, and welcome to my review of Returnal. A couple things before we get into the review proper. I just wanted to say, of course, huge thank you to the folks over at PlayStation Canada for providing a free copy of the game for the purpose of this review. Also, special shout out to our Patreon, patreon.com/YouMeCapri for making this opportunity possible as well. So you can go check out all of our stuff over there as well. Now, in case you've been living under a rock and maybe don't know anything about Returnal, Returnal, of course, is the newest game from Housemarque, the studio that brought us games like Resogun, Super Stardust HD, Dead Nation, Alien Nation, a whole bunch of other games that are basically top-down shooters or side-scrolling shooters, which is very different from Returnal, which is very much a third-person shooter. However, it's not as different as you might think it might be from some other earlier stuff, which, as a huge fan of Housemarque, I was actually really surprised and excited to actually see just how similar some of Returnal's mechanics are to some of the older games that I love from Housemarque. So let's start with the game's story. In Returnal, you play as Celine, a planetary scout who works for the Astor Corporation, who's trying to scout out habitable new worlds. After tracking a mysterious signal called White Shadow to the planet Atropos, Celine's ship crash lands on the planet. With her ship damaged, Celine sets off to explore Atropos to find a way to repair her ship while also trying to track the source of the White Shadow signal. Now, the story in Returnal actually moves very much to the background very quickly in this game. I mean, it's not like your traditional Sony first-party game that are so very story-heavy. Obviously, we've had other exclusives that aren't like this, but Returnal itself has a great story and an interesting story. Like, it has this really cool mystery to it that I really loved, but it's not really like overt with the story. It's not really trying to like hammer home the story. In fact, the story in a lot of ways is actually optional, which is kind of crazy because for the most part, past the initial cutscene and then the cutscene that plays every time you die, which we'll get into in a little bit, you're only really experiencing the game's story through audio diaries or through like runes that you'll find throughout the environment, or the ship's log that you'll actually unlock throughout the story, or these house segments that you may have seen in some of the trailers that take place in first person. I'm going to get to those in a little bit later as well. So the story itself in Returnal, I thought was actually really interesting as someone who's actually a huge fan of sci-fi horror. The story itself, again, had enough of a carrot on the end of his stick to actually really want me to pursue all of the optional collectibles in the environment, to want me to find out more about, who Celine was before she went to space, and before she kind of became an astronaut, why she became an astronaut and stuff like that. Like, I thought all that stuff was really interesting. Also, just learning more about the planet itself. Like, Atropos itself is kind of like its own character. It's constantly changing as you die and sort of go through the time loop that you're in. And I thought all that stuff was really interesting. So it's not probably going to win any awards or anything like that. Like, it's not like this big like award-winning story or anything like that. But I thought that the story itself was actually pretty strong overall, and I actually really enjoyed it. Again, sci-fi horror is actually probably one of my favorite genres. So if you're like into stuff like Aliens, I think you're going to be right at home with this. One of Returnal's main mechanics is its roguelike nature, and it works its way into the story as well. Each time Celine dies in the world, you'll see a random cutscene of Celine crash landing on the planet and waking up on Atropos once more. When this happens, the world is randomized, but not completely unfamiliar. So first of all, of course, the world of Atropos itself is actually divided into 6 different biomes. Basically, that's the term they use in the game itself, that basically are very different environmentally from each other. And you'll use either teleportation or you'll use shortcuts with upgrades that you'll get along the way to get to each new area. And each biome itself is randomized whenever you play the game, from when you start the game, but also every time you die, because Celine is essentially stuck in a time loop on this planet. And the planet, the way it's worded in the story is, again, the planet kind of like evolves around Celine. And each time you die, the planet evolves a little and kind of learns a little, and kind of changes in response to each run that you go on in the game, which I thought was actually really cool that they tried to work the roguelike elements into the story itself, even though, again, they don't really dive too much into it, except for in some of the audio logs and whatnot. So all in all, I thought that was interesting. And the roguelike nature, when I say that, it's a little bit familiar because each biome will be randomly generated, but at the same time, you'll have specific areas in each biome that'll be pretty much static across all your playthroughs. Some of the enemy placement or what enemies appear in that area might be a little bit different, but for the most part, you're kind of working with very familiar areas. Like if you play, like when I was playing through, it took me about 6 or 7 hours to beat Biome 1, and every time I replayed Biome 1, I would always run through the same rooms all the time, just in kind of almost in a different order every time, which again it was interesting. I will say though, that did grate on me a little bit, especially throughout the experience, because obviously I'm the type of person who really likes variety in his games, and especially when I'm just playing the same area over and over again. I don't mind that it's kind of like the same, visual style, but if it's got very similarly laid out areas, I'm less excited about that. Especially again, if it's like my 12th time going through the same area and I'm doing the same thing there. It almost reminded me of like old school games on like NES games that I used to play all the time, where you're going through a lot of the same areas. But in this, for whatever reason, I don't know why it bothered me more than in those games. Maybe though it's just because in like an older NES game, for example, the area is not changing. It's very much static, so you're able to memorize the patterns of some of the enemies. You're able to memorize your way through each level, and becomes a little less daunting each time you play through it. Whereas in Returnal, again, sometimes you get a random run where everything kind of goes your way, while in other times you just get beaten down over and over, and you get some ridiculous spawning enemies in areas. So it becomes a little bit less fun. And a little bit less exciting for someone like me anyways, who is not traditionally into roguelikes. I will say that as well, because obviously, having a roguelike game and reviewing a roguelike game, for someone like me who's not really into roguelikes, obviously I need to set that as my, kind of my bias going into the game. But at the same time, I'm always open to trying games from genres that I've never really been into. Games like, for example, like a game like Danganronpa, which is a visual novel slash detective mystery game, is the type of game that I would never be into. But as soon as I played Danganronpa, I was like, man, I'm really open to games like this, because I really enjoyed that game, and I've played a whole bunch of visual novels and stuff since, and really enjoyed them. So even when a game like this comes across my desk that is a genre that I'm not traditionally into, I love exploring this type of situation, because you never know. This might just be the one game that gets me into roguelikes. And for the most part, even though I nitpick a lot of this little stuff, I actually really like Returnal's gameplay. Like, I really love the gameplay loop that's in this game. I didn't really find it too frustrating or anything like that. Again, sure, it felt a little samey again when I was going towards the end of a biome, but at the same time, I don't know, I had a lot of fun with this game. Speaking of the gameplay, let's switch it over to the combat, and the combat itself in Returnal is top-notch. It's fantastic. It's one of my favorite things about this game. Of course, since it is a Housemarque game, you would expect it to be very arcadey, and it certainly is very arcadey. It's a very arcadey third-person shooter where, for the most part, the controls themselves are very loose. It's a very fast-moving game as well, and you have a lot of evasive maneuvers at your disposal, such as a dodge, as well as some other upgrades that you'll find along the way as you progress through the game itself. Again, I love just how fast the combat moves, and some of the way the gunplay works. Basically, as you start the game, you'll have access to 3 different weapons that, of course, you'll start with the pistol, but you'll find either a shotgun or a assault rifle in the environment, and you can switch to those if you want. And each one of those has like a different upgrade path that go along with it that are mostly determined by what biome you're in, but also just random stats that you'll find on the weapon along the way. And that all kinds of plays into the way the gunplay works. And as you go through each biome, you'll actually unlock a different weapon for each biome, and that will actually carry back to the previous biome, because when you die, you don't start at the beginning of the biome you're on. You start at the beginning of the game, and you have to progress all the way back. But you're usually more powerful at that point, whether you've obtained upgrades along the way that are permanent, or you'll get permanent unlockable abilities such as a grappling hook or some other cool tech that allow you to navigate the environment a little bit easier. So I thought all of that stuff super cool. Again, I love the game gunplay. I love the enemy design in this game as well. And some of the enemies you'll run into, they really make you think. Especially some of the later enemies can be really tough, and if you're not paying attention, can totally catch you off guard. I can't even tell you how many times I would go into an environment and an enemy spawns behind me and instantly kills me. Basically, like they'll shoot like a cluster of rockets at me. I won't notice until it's pretty much too late for me to dodge, and I'm dead. And I have to basically do the whole run over again. So yeah, I thought all that stuff really interesting. I love too that the enemies themselves are actually really evocative of enemies from games like Super Stardust, for example, where some of their attack patterns, for example, will be like they'll shoot like orbs like all around them in multiple different directions. So a lot of the looks of the enemy attacks, I think, really reminded me of different games from Housemarque itself, which again, as a huge Housemarque fan, I love that. Like I love that their visual design from all their games, like they really make great use of colors as well as a whole bunch of other great visual effects that make just mowing down enemies super satisfying. Not only that, but when you kill enemies, a lot of times they'll explode into little pellets and stuff like that. And depending on the enemy itself, just the death animation from some of them is great. So yeah, I love the combat in Returnal. It's one of the most addicting things about the game, and I loved going through all that stuff. I thought it was super fun. One other thing I love about the enemy design in this game are the bosses. I think the bosses in Returnal are fantastic. They have a lot of different phases and a bunch of different abilities in each phase, and I love just deconstructing each boss and kind of figuring out what makes them tick and kind of figuring out, okay, what the best pattern is for some of the bosses. I really enjoyed that aspect of it, and especially just beating a boss. Oh man, there was just no greater satisfaction than beating some of the bosses in Returnal. Especially like, I think the boss in the second biome, I actually like one-shotted, like I didn't die or anything like that. And just, again, just no greater feeling where I had like a sliver of health left and then I took down this huge boss. It was just so satisfying. It was just as satisfying as like beating some of the bosses in like Sekiro or Dark Souls or something like that. So I love the boss design in Returnal itself, and I love as well the idea that you can go challenge some of the bosses again. There are reasons to go do that as well. Like for example, if you pick up an upgrade that can only be redeemed once you finish a boss, it might be better to chance at beating some of the lower level bosses again, and then returning the item there rather than fighting one of the newer bosses. So I love that aspect as well. Again, the bosses themselves in this game, fantastic. One other thing that really intrigued me about the original trailer for Returnal as well was this segment that took place in first person in this house, and it was all creepy and stuff. It kind of reminded me of PT, and that all made it into the game. However, all that stuff is completely optional. You don't have to do it. However, you totally should, because you get some upgrades and really useful items from going into this house. So along the way, you'll find this 20th century house that you'll eventually find a key to. And then when you go in, basically you'll learn a little bit more about Celine and kind of her past. And then you'll unlock an item as soon as you finish that. Of course, these sections themselves, even though the whole game itself isn't really creepy, these sections in this house, pretty creepy. I mean, they're intentionally designed to kind of spook you a little bit, and I thought all that stuff was really cool. Again, as someone who loves horror, as I mentioned, I love how they worked these like horror elements into the story without it being like a big spooky game. Again, it's not like a Resident Evil or something like that. It's a very different style horror, but I really love these house sequences, especially too because, as I talked about earlier, I really love learning about Celine as a character, and I thought that these sections were pretty cool and a great way to kind of learn the powers. However, honestly, even though they're optional, I wish that they forced you to go through some of these areas, or especially because I know some people just completely missed these areas when they were going through it. So I really wish that they kind of like tried to steer you into the direction of going to the house, or likewise, every time I would reach a new biome, you can go back to the house and learn some more stuff about something. Again, the house itself only just exists in biome 1, and I'd have to remind myself to go back to the house, essentially. So I wish that there was more like push to try and get you to go to the house, because I thought the house itself was actually like one of the most interesting parts about the story in this game. And as well, again, the upgrades you get from it are actually like super useful. So I wish there was more of an on-ramp into going to the house. But overall, again, I love that the house segments. I thought they were all really well done. And again, just adding like a great like break and interesting kind of dynamic to the story that, again, we didn't really see before or anything like that. Let's talk about the DualSense controller as well, because the DualSense controller actually plays a big part of the experience in Returnal. First of all, of course, you've got the haptic feedback. Like you can feel like kind of the rain droplets falling on the controller in the first biome. You can also feel a lot of other environmental effects on the controller as well. I thought it was really immersive, and I really love what they did with the haptic feedback on the controller itself. I thought all that stuff was top notch. However, the adaptive triggers were the thing that I personally wasn't super into. So the way that the adaptive triggers work in this game is that essentially if you hold down the trigger halfway, you'll actually do your standard fire. However, if you hold down the left trigger about halfway, you'll zoom in, and then if you hold it down all the way, it'll do like an alternate fire for each weapon, because each weapon has like an alternate fire along with it. That again is also randomized per gun that you find. There's a specific subset of alternate fires that are available, and it just gives you one randomly each time you find a weapon. However, ultimately, what ended up happening was I always found myself kind of accidentally, when I was trying to zoom in and use my regular fire on an enemy, holding it down by accident and then using my alternate fire in places that I didn't want to use it, or it switching to my alternate fire and it not being recharged because it does have like a cooldown associated with it. And I found it kind of annoying that I would just do it all the time, because instinctively I'm so used to games like, Call of Duty, for example, where you aim down sights with the left trigger, and you don't really ever think about that. You don't think about, putting it down halfway. So a lot of that just has to do with muscle memory of playing other games. So I actually found that switching off the adaptive triggers actually really helped me get through the game a lot easier. I was less prone to make mistakes, and it basically takes that functionality and then assigns it to the R1 button, for example. So yeah, I would recommend, kind of playing around with it and seeing which system works best for you. Again, there's just a toggle in the menu for it. But yeah, like I thought it was interesting that they tried something different with it. And I do appreciate that Housemarque gave you a bunch of different options as well, in case you didn't like it, because there's a bunch of accessibility options in this game as well beyond this that I'm not going to dive too deep into. But I do like the option to either play with the adaptive triggers like this, or just completely turn it off completely if you don't like it. I love exploring Atropos in this game as well. It reminded me so much of exploring like something like Planet Zebes or Talon 4 in Metroid, where there's a whole bunch of like different secret areas you can find along the way, and each of these secret areas was like a little bit different from each other, and gave you a whole bunch of different useful power-ups you could find to help you with your journey. And finding all the secret areas itself was just super cool. So I love that aspect about it. If you like looking for secrets, I think you're going to really dig exploring the planet, especially because, again, it's randomized each time too. So the secrets areas are not in the same place every time. So I thought all that stuff was really, really cool. So how long is Returnal, you might ask? Well, Returnal took me about a little over 18 hours to finish the game. I know I'm a little bit slower than a lot of other people playing through it. I died a whole lot playing through the game. I died like 60 times, I think, in order to get through the game. So I died a lot in this game, because this game is not easy. But I still really enjoyed my time with it. Like, I thought that it was about 18 hours well spent. There's a lot of things to do once the game's over that, again, I'm not going to get into or spoil or anything like that. So know that even though it takes about 18 to 20 hours, let's say, to finish the game proper, there's lots to do when the game's over. There's a whole other set of endings and other stuff to do, or just the trophies themselves are a little bit of a grind. I know that some of the trophies for the Platinum Trophy just rely on a lot of random variants rather than skill. So I think that that might be a little bit frustrating to some people. But overall, I think that is definitely worth my time. However, obviously, the big question that has been going around with Returnal kind of ever since it's been announced at the $7 price point in the US, obviously here in Canada that's $90, is this game worth $70? However, that's not the question that I plan on answering in this review, mainly because how people perceive value is different from person to person. So here's what I want to kind of close out things with and kind of give my final thoughts as we transition into that. I think there's two segments of camps that you'll probably run into with this game. People that are into roguelikes, people who are not into roguelikes. And here's kind of my breakdown on which one of these camps you fall into. If you like roguelikes, honestly, I think you're probably really dig Returnal. I think it's a great roguelike, especially with other roguelikes like Dead Cells, Rogue Legacy, Hades. I think it stands toe-to-toe with all those games. So if you like roguelike games, I think you're going to probably really dig Returnal, and I definitely recommend giving it a try. It's one of those things where, honestly, I kind of miss the days where you could go rent a game from a store, because this is the type of game where I think if you're going to know you're going to want to pay, $70 for it, I think a rental would have gone a long way in kind of learning, okay, this game's probably for me and this game's not. So if you're into roguelikes, though, definitely this game's going to be up your alley, especially if you like sci-fi horror stuff. If you like Alien or Metroid or a bunch of other games that kind of have that same motif, I think, again, grab Returnal. You're not going to regret it. I think it's awesome. If you're in the non-roguelike camps, though, I think that's kind of the harder sell. I mean, especially, again, for someone like me who wasn't really into roguelikes before, I'm still not completely won over with roguelikes, even though I really enjoyed my time with Returnal. It definitely opened my eyes to trying more roguelikes, I think. But at the same time, I don't think that it's definitely become one of my favorite genres or anything like that. So it is definitely harder to recommend for people who are not into roguelikes. Obviously, I'm still going to encourage you to always try games kind of outside your comfort zone, because maybe, again, that'll probably be the one game that there could be the one game out there that could really get you into that genre and maybe show you what you're missing a little bit. So Returnal, I think, is probably more approachable even than some other roguelikes, even though, again, it's a little bit harder in difficulty than other roguelikes. I do think, though, that it's much more approachable, I think, than some other ones. So as an outsider to the genre, as someone who doesn't particularly love roguelikes, I actually still really enjoyed it despite all that. But would I pay full price for it? Probably not, if it was me personally. But obviously, again, that's everyone kind of values value differently. So obviously, if you're not into roguelikes, it's definitely a tougher ask to ask you to jump into it at full price, in which case I would say, wait, maybe pick it up on sale or something like that. Or, I mean, you can definitely take a try on it and get it at full price. But again, might not win you over on roguelikes, just like me. So I would say maybe hold off on it until it's at a price where you're comfortable paying, knowing what you're getting into with this game. And that's all for my review of Returnal, a game that I honestly really loved a lot. Again, I was going into it really excited for it because, again, I love Housemarque. And even though it was in a genre that I'm not really into as far as roguelikes are concerned, again, just having the genre of being sci-fi horror really appealed to me, again, which is why I was really excited about the game, combined with the fact that obviously I like to play games outside my comfort zone. So I am glad that I got a chance to play Returnal for the purposes of this review. And honestly, I love my time with it, and I hope you're enjoying it as well. So what do you think about Returnal? Let me know in the comments below. Of course, huge shout out again to PlayStation Canada for providing a copy of the game for this review. As always, you can check me out on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You can also find us on Twitter at the Xbox Drive. That's my Xbox podcast. We also have a PlayStation podcast coming up. In fact, this was kind of like a precursor for that PlayStation podcast called the PlayStation Drive, which is coming soon. May 21st is the day we're launching that. Myself and Matt are hosting that. I'll have more details about that on my Twitter page as well. So on twitter.com/Ryan Turford, you can go find out all the information about that. Also, I have an RPG podcast coming up soon called The RPG Cave. You can find us on Twitter at The RPG Cave, as well as on YouTube and all your podcast services. That's going to be starting up in about a week and a half as well. Again, all the details about that are on my Twitter as well. All that said, all that out of the way as well. Thank you so much for checking out my review of Returnal. I'm Ryan Turford, and I'm out.